How can we solve transportation problems related to crumbling infrastructure, surging congestion, poor air quality, increasing GHG emissions, and declining revenues? One proven approach is to implement a range of mobility pricing strategies, including gas taxes, road tolls, parking fees, and transit fares. Since this is easier said than done, especially in a COVID-altered world, transportfutures.ca invites you to learn from and with international experts during our online mobility pricing conversations now underway. The third one-hour session, taking place on November 30th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, features Harry Kitchen, Professor Emeritus of Economics at Trent University in Peterborough, Canada. He and Transport Futures founder Martin Collier will discuss whether the gas tax can remain relevant as a transport infrastructure revenue source in the face of inflation, more efficient motor vehicles, and retail politics. They look forward to responding to your questions and comments. Join this cutting-edge conversation, co-sponsored by Daily Commercial News, by registering today at transportfutures.ca/MPC. Hello and welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media editor Warren Frey. On this episode, we talked to Residential Construction Council of Ontario President Richard Lyall about his thoughts about the federal government's recent fall economic statement, the ongoing housing crisis, and what he thinks could help solve this increasingly intractable problem. But first, here's the latest headlines from the Daily Commercial News and the Journal of Commerce. Construction stakeholders are calling for swift action from the Ontario government to address confusion over the health and safety responsibilities of municipal project owners in the wake of the controversial Supreme Court of Canada decision in R v. Greater Sudbury. The case stems from a 2015 incident in the Northern Ontario city where a road grader driven by an employee of Interpaving Limited struck and killed a pedestrian while driving in reverse through an intersection. It was a municipal project. This will be an ongoing story, so make sure to keep checking the Daily Commercial News for updates. We also have more stories from the recent Canadian Council for Public-Private Partnerships P3 conference in Toronto, including DCN staff writer Angela Gismondi's article about a panel that examined both the successes and challenges of the Eglinton Crosstown West Extension project. Successes included an accelerated design schedule, a collaborative and cooperative strategy amongst all parties, and a series of incentives upon completion of major project milestones. But the schedule is also the main challenge for the project. According to panelist Jose Luis Aravello, the tunnel's global lead at TYPSA, an independent consulting and engineering services group. Also, make sure to check out our brownfield remediation feature, which includes a story from Dan O'Reilly about the Birchley Park development, termed a brownfield gem in Toronto's quarry lands. In the Journal of Commerce, we have news of an accident at a downtown Vancouver construction site after a facade fell off a church building onto scaffolding, which sent 3 workers to hospital. The incident happened on Wednesday as concrete was being pumped into a chimney on the building, which burst, toppled over, and pushed over a scaffolding tower, pinning workers underneath, according to traffic control worker Samantha Newlove. Journal of Commerce staff writer Sarah Rowland has a story about the Wascana Pool in Regina, which is setting a new standard in Canada by focusing on inclusivity. Replacing its 72-year-old predecessor, this newly reopened facility in Wascana Park, at the heart of Saskatchewan's capital, is hoping to be the most accessible and inclusive pool in Canada. The $16.4 million project is a collaboration between P3A Partnership and HCMA. It's a pool complex that features a 25-yard lap pool with a switchback ramp, catering to both competitive and recreational swimmers. The leisure pool area, spanning 700 cubic meters, offers a zero-depth entry for families and children. Alongside, the pool complex includes a lazy river, a hot tub with an accessible ramp, and a dual flume water slide. John Bleasby's latest legal notes column, available on both sites, looks at both the advantages and risks of drones in construction. Advantages include mapping, LiDAR, and new ways to monitor health and safety. But along with that comes worries about collisions, operator errors, and regulations that may apply near building sites. And that's it for the news this week. But up next, here's Richard Lyall with his thoughts on the fall economic statement. What are the good things that came out of this fall economic statement, bearing in mind that we're going to have a budget sometime in a few months too?
Okay, so looking for the diamond in the rough there, I guess the most important thing is the attention that's been given to housing, because housing is so fundamentally important to the economy and to the welfare of people. You know, housing's a need. It's not something that's optional for the majority of Canadians, and it's also the most expensive thing that people spend money on in their lives, and you can't do without it now. And we do have a crisis. We had a crisis arguably before the pandemic. This is something that we've seen coming for many years. We've issued many reports along the way and have raised concerns. I can remember being on a housing supply committee almost 20 years ago, with the government. So So it is finally getting the attention that it deserves. We're getting past these silly arguments about, no, we don't need more supply, that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
And they've made arguably some big moves there on the issue. So that much is good. But there's a lot more that's remains troubling and that isn't good.
So, what are some of those
Yeah.
things?
Well, I guess first and foremost, one of the big issue that we're now dealing with, amongst many others, but the most recent one is what's happened with interest rates and mortgages and things like that. And of course, governments are tapped out, and in a time of recovery, that's when they're supposed to be kind of cutting back a little bit. You don't run deficit spending budgets and spending and in a recovery. That's just not good. And so, even the head of the Bank of Canada has said that some of these policies and programmatic items are adding to inflation, which is something that we're trying to get down because, of course, there's direct connection there with interest rates. Aside from that, the size of the crisis, it's a massive crisis. It's actually more of a growth management planning crisis than it is of a housing crisis, but it's huge. So when we talk about, a few $1 billion here and there and stuff like that, yeah, sure, that's important. But, the CMHC has said this is a $1 trillion problem. Now, unfortunately, most people don't really kind of grasp the distinction between $1 billion and $1 trillion. You start getting into stratospheric numbers like that, and it's a problem. But right now, within the marketplace, things are slowing and starts are going to start falling. We're going to see those numbers. There's always a lag effect. Aside from everything else, there's a problem with our data too, but that's another issue. And so we're moving in the wrong direction. And what we really need to do is effectively double our housing production. And so we're a long way from that. The other thing is that, of the $15 billion, I believe that money will start to flow in 2025, which is, okay, let's say that's a year and a half from now. We've got a crisis right now. We've got people like, the mayor of Brampton saying that there are going to be people dying because we don't have appropriate shelter. I was talking to Mayor Chow about it the other day, and she gets it and is very concerned about it and really wants to do things there. But of course, her hands are tied. And one of the big issues we've got right now is that all levels of government are fiscally and financially challenged. And keeping in mind that about 90% of housing is really in the private sector domain. And if the private sector domain is not functioning properly and hasn't been for many years because of systemic issues, whether it's a slow approvals process, excessive taxation on housing, we tax alcohol for some bizarre reason. Well, I know why that happened. You had three levels of government piling into housing like some kind of cash cow and all taking their piece out of it. And it was kind of insidious because those numbers just kept creeping up. And now we're at a point where it's, 31% of the cost of a new home is in taxes, fees, and levies. And that should never have happened. It needs to be rolled back, this kind of thing. But they're not really dealing effectively with that. I mean, they started on the rental housing, but, in principle, whether you rent or buy is a matter of choice, and we shouldn't be discriminated against people that choose to buy rather than rent. I mean, I get what they're doing there, and that's a whole other discussion, but and I'm glad they did what they did on rental housing, but we still need to deal, at the municipal level with our approvals process issues. We're 34th out of 35 countries in the developed world in how efficiently we deal with that. At the provincial level, there's still other measures that need to be, I'll say, imposed, arguably, because waiting for municipalities to come around is not necessarily, we don't have the time for that. Some municipalities get this completely and are very active and doing some incredible things. You've got like Mayor Guthrie in Guelph, who is a leader in this regard in terms of getting the housing situation and stuff like that. But you've got other municipalities that aren't as enlightened, shall we say. And then at the federal level, it's the whole tax environment. And Canadians we've simply got to the point where we're taxed too much. And the government is not spending that money efficiently, arguably. And we've got obviously the deficits and the payment of the interest on that debt is rapidly increasing. And we've done it before. In the 60s and 70s, we had a situation where we had half the population we have now. We were building as many houses as we are now, and there were a number of tax programs in place that really spurred the 80% of the rental housing that we have today. The purpose-built rental housing is a product of the 60s and 70s. So we did it before. Let's do it again. I mean, it's not like this is some giant mystery we're trying to figure out. It's people can't afford now what the industry can produce. We can't even really build new housing for middle class people anymore, and we're really choking our best and brightest, the young, up and comers, our STEM stars. We're seeing a bit of an exodus now out of Toronto. And that is not a good thing, because Toronto is a productivity center and it is the engine of growth for Ontario and Canada, the GTA. Saying that, well, that's okay, they'll move to some other town and, live there and it'll be good for the economy there. That's really not the way it works, right? And we're losing quite a few to the US. And then sort of bizarrely, we're saying, well, we don't, our birth rate's declining to almost zero because, a lot of young people are not having kids for a good reason. They can't afford a home. So the answer to that then is immigration, which is kind of odd, but and then we've got the challenges with immigration, because if our housing supply is not increasing,
then where they live,
and we're still bringing in 500,000 people a year, and it was just announced. I mean, the Minister Miller at the federal level just announced, and there's a bit of a history of this too, that they said, we're starting to align, immigration policy with housing policy and infrastructure and healthcare and stuff like that. This is 2023. You'd think that alignment would have been ongoing for some time, right? So, I chuckle about that, but that's because, like, we're really missing the boat here on a number of levels. The good thing is that it is fixable. So this budget really did have a focus on housing. There was some big numbers in there. I mean, but it's it's going to take a year and a half before that really kicks in. And of course, this is for new rental housing. All those things take time to build and develop. The housing industry is kind of like a super tanker. It's not a speedboat. You can't turn it. You can't go into hard turns, and it takes a long time to turn things around. But the immediate problem and the continued immigration is happening now and will be happening over the next year. So this is where I'm concerned. And the bigger thing, I think, is that we have a national housing strategy, apparently, but it's not a national housing strategy. It's not a plan. The three levels of government are not sufficiently aligned. And Canada, yes, this is a global problem. You'll hear, Minister Freeland say, well, it's affecting other parts of the world, and that's true, it is. But we just happen to be one of the worst performers globally on housing. And we're ironically, the country with the most land, which
that's true.
That kind of makes you wonder.
You mentioned in the release to right after the fall economic statement that we need a Marshall Plan of some sort. So maybe you could address how that would happen.
So what that would entail is some kind of effort to bring the three levels of government together with the industry and with certain social housing providers. I don't mean to leave them out because they're critically important, but the private market is really the big thing that needs to start working properly we need to look at the numbers and say, okay, what do we need here? And I always learned from years ago from David Foote, the demographer, that demographics don't lie, and they don't. Those are hard numbers. And so, okay, and we've got various measures of what needs to be done here. You've got the province of Ontario said 1.5. Professor Moffat would say it's really 1.7 because of some other things. And then the CMHC is saying, they've got their numbers, which are 3.5 or 5.7, depending on which, year you peg it to. But they're massive numbers. So we need to have a coordinated attack on this to say, okay, where do we need the housing? Break it down by municipality and so on and so forth. And what kind of housing should that be? We do have numbers, like there's a number for City of Toronto, 285,000 units, right? That's great. 285,000 units of what? And when can we do it? And how can we build it? We talk about labor supply shortages and different things like this. So, that's brought up to the discussion of modular and panelized housing, what we call offsite construction. Okay, yes, we do need more of that. There's no doubt about that. But the question is, who's going to build the factories and, all this other stuff, and how can we make that happen? So this all needs to be coordinated, because right now it's a mess. We've got different levels of government doing different things. Some of them are in partnership with others. There was an announcement the other day, Freeland and Chow, for 2,600 units in Toronto, and that's nice. It's great, $1.2 billion. And then you've got other announcements for 60 units here or 500 there, or whatever. But that's not implementing a plan, because there is no plan to implement. You've got different people going off in different directions, and it's a big country, and that needs to be pulled together. And the Marshall Plan part of it is to say, okay, what are we doing that that is impeding and barriers to housing, the financial part of it, this kind of thing. And what have we done in the past that has solved some of these problems, like the 60s and 70s? And okay, that worked then. Why don't we do it now? Now, there were some big differences. Back in the 60s and 70s, the approvals process was very quick. Construction of buildings was simpler. We built good buildings. They're still standing. None of them have collapsed, but it was easier to build. The financial situation was more straightforward. The regulatory situation was more transparent. And we were able to, and the immigration system worked better. We had people arriving here and they were working on job sites within 2 days. We didn't have the same, the problems that we've created with immigration. Where we have, for a number of years there, we weren't bringing in the amount of skilled tradespeople we should have been bringing in, and of course, and then we had the problem with our own school system where we kind of eviscerated vocational training and all those things. I mean, but these are all things that we've identified and can be fixed, but there needs to be some kind of coordinated approach to this, because got the different levels of government, and then with each level of government, you got different departments and ministries all off doing their own thing too, as well. And ergo, Minister Miller's saying we're going to start aligning different policies in 2023, right? That alignment needs to be expanded and needs to be include other levels of government. And funnily enough, I've said, this is not an ideological problem. This is not a left or right issue. We're a market economy. A lot of this is straight up market economics. There is a social housing need here, definitely, because we do have people in our society that, through no fault of their own, or for one reason or other, can't afford housing. So they do need, this is where your social housing component comes in. And that's really where the government should be focused. The focus on the private sector housing for the government is to ensure that the market is working efficiently. And the market is not working efficiently right now. It's dysfunctional. That's why, when you see people say, oh, well, Toronto's doing great. You get all those towers in the sky, more cranes than anywhere else in North America. And yeah, that's great. We are doing a great job on that. But that was also a reflection of our dysfunctional system, because we weren't building mid-rise housing. We had the missing middle, and we definitely have not been building enough low-rise housing. There's a need for both of those things. So where, because of our system, we basically effectively pushed a lot of the development into these high-rise structures, which is great, but that's a very specific product that serves some very specific markets. And
Right.
Not to say, and high-rise is good. It has its place and
Mm-hmm.
it's wonderful, but we just, that was the only thing we had in our playbook, in a sense. We went from 2/3 of the housing we used to produce back 20 years ago was low-rise. Now it's 1/3. And by low-rise, I mean, sort of below 4 stories, right?
Right. Right.
And then, we still have places like Danforth Avenue that have, 1 and 2 story buildings above a subway, and the subway's been there for 50 years. That's really the best example of what's wrong with how we've not planned for growth.
And so what's RESCON's role in all this? How are you a sort of glue to kind of tie these things together, or do you have a different role than that?
Yeah, no, well, what RESCON, our council is about trying to eliminate barriers to new housing fundamentally, and try to make create opportunities for our members. Builders like to build. We want to build housing, and so we've progressively over time, as our world has become more complicated and buildings become more complicated, we've got more and more involved in different issues, and we've had to get more and more involved and generate reports. Like, for example, we were part of the group that did the report on, what, as a percentage of GDP, are we spending enough on infrastructure? And that was a groundbreaking report that came up because it showed that we were at about 50%. We should have been spending about 5.1% of GDP on infrastructure, and we were around 2.6. We recently participated with another group I guess about 6 months ago. We produced the report, which asked the question, how high are the taxes, fees, and levies now on new housing? And the number was an astounding 31%. And we realized that we're taxing housing like booze. We're treating it's like a sin tax. You tax something that high, that's a need. Housing is a need. In economics, you've got needs and wants, right? You don't need a Porsche, you might want one, right? But you do need some kind of transportation, right, to get to and from work. So housing is a need for the vast majority of people, and we certainly don't tax food that way, right? You can imagine what would happen there if we did that. And it was kind of an insidious erosion over the last 20 years. Like, so for example, the down payment for the average millennial or Gen Z, or, the up and coming people, really anybody, might be someone older than that, is really that amount of money is really the increase in the HST tax and development charges in the last 20 years. And the HST was supposed to originally have been adjusted for inflation. It was only originally supposed to capture like the real, really expensive stuff. And DCs are bizarre in that, they say growth pays for growth and all this stuff. And it was, of course, that was all nonsense, but, they blew it past people. But what DCs are basically a straight up regressive discriminatory tax. It's not income tested.
Can you say what that is, a DC, for those who don't know?
Oh, development charges.
Okay.
The development charges. So, like, for example, about 12 years ago, a development charge on a 2-bedroom condo in Toronto was about $8,000. And now it's, the last number I checked, it was about $88,000. So you've had an exponential growth on development charges, and it's a DC. It's a charge per unit. It doesn't matter who's buying the unit or whatever. And it actually did cover, it covered social housing, it covered everything else like that. The reason why they grew was because of the costs or the dysfunction of the cost sharing arrangement between senior levels of government and municipalities. They downloaded stuff on the municipalities and they said, hey, you can have DCs, go ahead and tax. But, it's a very un-Canadian way, because it really put the burden on new renters and new buyers, massive burden there, when in fact the economic benefits of growth apply to all, and the cost should apply to all. and that was something, like we didn't have that back in the 60s and 70s. So when you think about if you're buying $1 million worth of real a home in the GTA area, $310,000 for taxes, fees, and levies that people are going to amortize for 25 years, right? And it's just not fair, and it doesn't make sense because what happens is that if the cost of housing gets too high with these things, then young people and best and brightest, they're not going to be able to save up to, say, start a business and create opportunities. And that's why another reason why you've probably heard that productivity numbers in Canada are terrible. And one of the reasons that's because basically out of 4 Canadians essentially gets a paycheck from the government. And some of them are doing very useful work and stuff like that, but some maybe not so much, right? So, and of course, we've got the runaway train in Ottawa with consultants. It's increased sixfold under the current government. The use of external consultants, I think, is $20 billion a year. And you think, well, don't we have professionals working in the government that can? Yeah. I mean, there are times when you hire a consultant, but it's so things have gotten way out of whack, and we've got to get it back. And so RESCON's role is to do what we can to address these issues. And in fact, some of our best work is actually stopping silly things from coming forward. Right? We call it playing whack-a-mole. You get these crazy ideas popping out of different departments of different governments, and you got to shoot them down. Like, for example, on net zero construction. I mean, that's a whole wild story right there. I mean, the city of Toronto wants to be net zero by 2028, which is, completely delusional. And some of these things are, okay, it's nice. We'll save, we all understand climate change and the need to improve efficiency. And we've got a building code, for example, process that's progressively addressing these issues. But we've had situations where you've got individual municipalities declaring climate crises and then cooking up their own particular plan to address it that affects building. And some of them are really dumb. I mean, they won't even meet their objective, and they do it quite often without any cost benefit analytics. And we already have a housing crisis. So we're still dealing with issues like that today, where we're saying we got to get costs down so people can afford housing. And we're still dealing with, new ideas coming out every day to increase costs. And then you get things like inclusionary zoning, which is nice. But again, that's another program that guess who pays for that? The other occupants of the building, whether they're new renters or new buyers, and it doesn't make sense. I mean, I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't have affordable, what you'd call deeply affordable housing mixed in with other housing. I'm a great believer in that. Sort of having those mixed communities because it's better for kids growing up in that environment. Blah 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 blah. But you can't sort of just impose these things because what it does is it kills projects. And then we have the exclusionary zoning, which we've dealt with now, but that's not, again, going to turn things around in any, with it's good. Like we've been eliminating barriers that shouldn't have existed in the first place, and now we're starting to do some new things, but we've got to really pick it up. This is an absolutely urgent crisis. And it is I saw an article the other day came out of Policy Options that said, why are we still saying we don't have a supply crisis? And you want to shoot yourself when you see this stuff because and it's written by somebody, we've got many of these so-called experts on housing who really, and some of them are in academia, and they really don't know what the hell they're talking about. They've never gotten in the shoes of someone who's investing in a project and has to go through what is often a very nightmarish process to get something improved. There's a lot of things and talk there about speeding up the system and making it more efficient and stuff like that. but it hasn't really taken hold yet. We're still dealing with our members every day, and they're having all kinds of problems with different site servicing infrastructure issues, site locates, some pretty fundamental basic stuff. And in actual fact, we're getting to the point where we're in a process of now trying to redefine affordability. What is affordable housing? It's like, okay, so the current definition doesn't work because we look really bad. So let's redefine it so maybe we don't look so bad anymore, or other things like that, on the building regulatory side that are silly.
Well, this is certainly a lot to chew on.
It is a big problem, and that's why you really need that start chamber. You need the experts at the table. You need people. I've been in meetings and I've said, I represent the people that if you turned around and said, "Hey, Susan, can you build a 40-story building?" And she says, "Yes, I know exactly how to do that." Now, there's not a lot of people like that, right? It's like, imagine building your own home, right? If someone said to you, "Go and build your own home. Here's a piece of land and here's a bunch of stuff, materials and things."
I'd be in big trouble.
You'd be in big trouble. Yeah, most people would be. And then, we've got 45 different government agencies and bodies that are involved in the approvals process. And that has grown over time. And the amount of time it takes to get something approved has lengthened. And of course, as we know, and we've measured this, we've done measurements, every month delay in getting something approved, we're talking somewhere in the magnitude of thousands of dollars a month in the delay cost. The old expression, time is money, right? And people, oh, well, we got to, I said to people, our industry is a good industry. It's thousands of builders and contractors. We've built millions of homes, and tell me how many collapses there have been, right? Of these homes. And our industry does a good job. We do some things every now and then. Something pops out of the industry that's somebody who's done something wrong, and it kind of catches the media's attention. But by and large, it's a phenomenal industry. I'm very proud of it. But it just, I find it fundamentally, and I've traveled all around the world. I've had the privilege of doing that. I find it just so disconcerting and offensive that every Canadian doesn't have a decent place to live, right? I don't go so far as saying it's a human right, because I don't know what that means, right, in financial terms, but we certainly have the capability of ensuring that everyone has a decent place to live. And there's all the other attenuating, healthcare, education, so many other things come out of that. Housing is the number one thing. You can, you can do without a car, but you can't do without a place to live. You can't do without food. So we need to put housing up on a pedestal.
I think that's a great place to leave it. So thank you very much for joining us, Richard.
Okay, cheers. Thank you.
And that's it for this week. If you'd like to hear more episodes of the Construction Record Podcast, you can hear us on Amazon Music, Apple Music, and Spotify, as well as the Journal of Commerce and Daily Commercial News websites. Thanks for listening.